All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into two of the most absolutely brutal unsolved crimes of the 20th century. We're talking about two different massacres that happened an ocean apart but shared a horrifying, bloody signature, a signature that's had people stumped for more than 100 years. So, this is the big question, the one we're really digging into today. Is it possible that a single, shadowy figure was responsible for a horrific crime scene in rural Iowa, and then another, chillingly similar one on a remote farm in Germany? That's the mystery at the heart of all this. So, to really understand this chilling connection, we first have to look at each crime on its own. And we're going to start our story in the American Midwest, where one seemingly peaceful night in a very quiet town turned into an absolute nightmare. Okay, take a look at this house. This was the home of the Moore family in Villisca, Iowa. On the morning of June 10th, 1912, the entire family, that's Josiah, Sarah, their four children, and two little girls who were just sleeping over, were all found bludgeoned to death in their beds. So let's just break down the horrible facts here. We're talking about 8 victims. And get this, 6 of them were children. They were all slaughtered with an axe that actually belonged to the family, just hours after they'd all been at a church event. I mean, the community was just completely shattered, and even though this massive investigation kicked off, it led to absolutely no answers. Just a whole lot of fear. Now let's jump forward 10 years and hop across the Atlantic. Because while the memory of Villisca was starting to fade, a second massacre was about to unfold, and it had some deeply disturbing parallels. This time, we're at a super remote farmstead in Germany called Hinterkaifeck. 6 members of the Gruber household were killed. And again, the killer used a tool they found right on the property, this time a mattock, which is kind of like a pickaxe. But as you're about to see, what the killer did after the murders was just as bizarre and maybe even more terrifying than the crime itself. Okay, so this is where it starts to get really weird. When you put these two crime scenes right next to each other, the similarities are they're staggering, and they go way beyond just the choice of weapon. You can see the eerie parallels right here. In both cases, the attacker didn't bring a weapon. They used one that belonged to the victims. But the aftermath, that's what's so strange. In the Liska, the killer covered all the mirrors with cloths. In Hinterkaifeck, the killer actually lingered for days, tending to the livestock, eating the family's food, all while the bodies were lying just yards away. And the clues just get stranger. At Villisca, there was a slab of bacon left near the axe. Just bizarre. At Hinterkaifeck, strange things had been happening for days beforehand. There were footprints in the snow leading to the house, but not away. The house keys went missing, and they heard sounds in the attic. It all points to a killer who was incredibly patient, methodical, and just completely unafraid. Now, with crimes this brutal, you can bet that local law enforcement immediately started looking at people with personal motives. The neighbors, any rivals, estranged family members, the usual suspects. So let's look at who they considered. In Villisca, a lot of suspicion fell on Frank Jones, who was a business rival of Josiah Moore. And then there was Reverend George Kelly, a really peculiar traveling minister who actually confessed to the crime, though his confession was later considered unreliable. Over at Hinterkaifeck, the police looked hard at Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had let's call it a complicated relationship with the family. They even wondered if Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who everyone thought died in World War I, might have secretly come back. But in the end, nothing stuck. No one was ever convicted. And here's the really tragic part. Any chance of a definitive answer was probably lost right at the very beginning. In both cases, the crime scenes were hopelessly contaminated. We're talking dozens of people trampling through the Moore house, and at Hinterkaifeck, crucial evidence was disturbed by the very neighbors who found the bodies. It was a mess. But what if the killer wasn't local at all? This is where we get to a truly terrifying theory that connects these crimes, and maybe a lot of others, to a single traveling predator. So this theory was really brought into the spotlight by authors Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James. They wrote a book called The Man from the Train, and it suggests that a single nomadic serial killer was responsible for a whole string of these kinds of massacres. And they actually gave him a name, Paul Muller. They think he was a German immigrant, and their research suggests that Muller could have been responsible for dozens of family slayings all across America. If they're right, he'd be one of the most prolific serial killers in the country's history. And this right here is the key. Mueller's alleged signature, his MO, it lines up almost perfectly with all the strange details from both of these crime scenes. Attacking families in small towns near railroad tracks, using a tool from the property, covering the victims' faces after death, leaving valuables behind, locking the house from the inside before he left. It's a terrifyingly consistent pattern. Now, the timeline is just chillin'. This specific type of axe murder really peaked in 1911 and early 1912. But then, right after Villisca, just as the press and detectives started to connect the dots, the murders in America just stopped. Cold. And then a decade later, a nearly identical crime pops up in Germany. And this all leads to a pretty fascinating conclusion from the authors of The Man from the Train. They actually assign a number to it, a 40% probability that Paul Mueller was also the killer at Hinterkaifeck. So they are almost certain he's the Villisca Axe murderer. But for Hinterkaifeck, that decade-long gap and the move to a whole other continent, that makes the connection compelling, for sure, but it's not a slam dunk, and that's why they give it that 40% probability. So after all of this, where does that leave us with these two horrific cases? Well, ultimately, without a confession or any real forensic evidence, Paul Mueller is still a theory. It's a very, very convincing one, but it's still a theory. And so, officially, both of these brutal massacres are still cold cases. These mysteries just endure. They're in newspaper headlines, in local lore. They're just haunting reminders of the devastating violence that completely shattered these seemingly peaceful little towns, and a reminder that justice was never, ever served. And the indignities, they just kept coming, even after death. In a final grim twist, the skulls of the Hinterkaifeck victims were sent away for analysis and were actually lost during World War II. So they're gone, forever preventing modern science from ever getting a chance to find new clues. It really makes you wonder. We tend to think of these as isolated, awful events, but what if they're not? How many other dark figures have just moved through history like ghosts, their crimes connected by a single thread that we've just never been able to see?